Great. Rules Committee will come to order, and thank you for joining us for another fun day. Judge, how are you? We're delighted that you're back, and the Rules Committee is available today to handle a lot of very important bills that have been talked about for a long period of time. I noticed that we're visited today by the gentleman from North Carolina, Walter Jones, a gentleman from Florida, former Ambassador Rooney. We're delighted that you're here to see your Rules Committee in action. The Ambassador told me the other day he had not been up at the Rules Committee as much as he wanted to, and I said, well, your fellow Floridian, Alcee Hastings, is here and ready every day, so I'm delighted, Francis, that you're with us. Today, the committee will consider H.R. 2213, the Anti-Border Corruption Reauthorization Act of 2017, as well as H.R. 10, the Financial Choice Act of 2017. U.S. Border Patrol agents and Office of Field Operations Officers are the most important resources for our border security. Bottom line is that the front line, protecting America, not only at our borders, but the men and women who are trained, prepared, and ready to intercept and to ensure that the laws of this country are well maintained. Unfortunately, the border is critically understaffed. It was allowed to do this, and it's a mistake, and well below congressionally mandated staffing levels by more than 1,000 officers and 1,800 Border Patrol agents. And even with the recent push to hire more officers and agents, the process is slow and arduous, which means we must act. H.R. 2213 expedites the hiring process for certain well-qualified applicants who have already proven themselves trustworthy in the United States military or in law enforcement. These small changes that we intend to do in this bill will provide CBP with immediate relief so that they're able to more quickly yet judiciously hire more officers and agents from a pool of applicants that have already received the public's trust. The committee will also consider Financial Choice Act of 2017, which is a comprehensive reform piece of legislation to create hope and opportunity for investors, consumers, and entrepreneurs by ending taxpayer-funded bailouts and misguided concept of what I think is too big to fail piece of legislation that really is a part of where we reside today. This new legislation holds Washington and Wall Street accountable. It eliminates red tape to increase access to capital and credit and repeals provisions of the Dodd-Frank Act that make America less prosperous, less stable, and I believe less free. Nationwide, 43% of banks under $100 million in assets have disappeared, and there have been only 6 new bank charters since Dodd-Frank was passed into law, compared to 170 charters on average the year before Dodd-Frank. It's simply a staggering statistic, but exactly in line with what the legislation was intended to do. H.R. 10 will roll back Dodd-Frank's misguided policies and replace them with new rules that will create more opportunity, more choice, and I believe more economic freedom for more Americans. We must empower Americans to achieve financial independence, and I want to commend Chairman Jeb Hensarling from the 5th District of Texas for his tireless hard work, not only as chairman of the Financial Services Committee, but also his work as a congressman to initiate this compilation of a tremendously important legislation. It is it's long due piece of legislation, and I think the American people, once they learn more about this, will find out that Chairman Hensarling's hard work, as well as that of the committee, will be there in the best interest of consumers and to grow economic success for more Americans. I'd like to first, however, welcome the author of H.R. 2213, the gentlewoman from Arizona, Congresswoman McSally, a gentlewoman who served in the United States Air Force as a pilot of an A-16.
A-10, sir.
A-10, excuse me, that's my fault, an A-10, who I first met on the phone years ago when she decided she was going to run for Congress. She's an exciting member of this body, and I'm delighted that she's here. Please be advised, Congresswoman McSouthey, anything you have in writing, as well as our witnesses, anyone that appears before the committee today, will have, without objection, anything in writing will be entered the record, and we look forward to their testimony. At this time, I'd like to yield to the gentleman from Massachusetts, ranking member of the committee, for his opening statement. As he would choose, gentleman is recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be brief. I oppose both these bills. On the bill that Congresswoman McSally's here to testify, I know that there's bipartisan support for what she's trying to move forward. I understand the need to hire more people along our border, but I don't think that should require waiving polygraph tests. I mean, the FBI, the ATF, DEA, and Secret Service agents and all other federal law enforcement agencies require polygraph tests prior to their employment. They don't waive it. I don't think we should do it here, but whatever. I mean, we will move forward on this bill. And then the Wrong Choice Act that my Republican friends are bringing forward here to basically gut the Dodd-Frank bill, I think represents an all-time high in recklessness and stupidity, quite frankly. It's moving us back to the days where we'll once again see the kind of excesses in the financial services industry that led to 11 million people losing their homes, all the unemployment rate skyrocketing again. The Dodd-Frank bill, while not perfect, provides us with some of the strongest consumer protections in history, and just to kind of toss that all away is something that I think is a bad idea. But anyway, my Republican friends are in charge, and so they can do whatever the heck they want to. But I think you'll regret this day if, in fact, it is successful, making its way through the House, Senate, and having this president sign it, which I'm sure he will sign, because he seems to be totally beholden to Wall Street and financial services special interests. So with that, I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for his comments, and I'm delighted that we are back. Today is a good opportunity for our members who come back fresh from a week in their district, a week in providing information and data, not only to people in their district, but learning more about the world we live in, and making sure that America's standing and value is achieved. And I want to thank the gentleman. Congresswoman, we're delighted that you're here. You've already hit the green button, so you're ready to go. Gentlewoman's now recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate it. Thanks for allowing me to testify on my bill, H.R. 2213, the Anti-Border Corruption Reauthorization Act of 2017. As most of you know, my district includes 80 miles of the southern border, so how to best secure the border and increase cross-border commerce has my full and undivided attention. In my view, we need the right mix of three things to secure the border: adequate manpower, surveillance technology, and infrastructure. And we need three things to provide greater cross-border economic activity: adequate manpower, infrastructure, and technology. Of these elements, our U.S. Border Patrol agents and our U.S. Customs and Border Protection officers are, at the end of the day, the most important border security and trade resource that we have. All of the technology and infrastructure deployed along the border is useless if we don't have well-trained agent or officer that's present to make an arrest, interdict a drug load, or screen cargo from a country of concern, or speed legitimate trade and commerce through a port of entry. However, CBP is critically understaffed and remains well below its congressionally mandated staffing levels by more than 1,000 CBP officers, these are the blue suiters at the ports of entry, and 1,800 Border Patrol agents, the green suiters, out and between the ports of entry. Unfortunately, the manpower shortage is getting worse. We're simply losing ground every single month. There's no end in sight as we continue to lose experienced agents and officers through attrition without the ability to quickly hire new ones. I want to emphasize this point. Officer and agent shortages did not happen overnight. The U.S. Border Patrol has not met its congressionally mandated hiring numbers since fiscal year 2014 under the Obama administration. And CBP has been losing officers to man our ports of entry since fiscal year 16 under the Obama administration. We have highly trained officers and border agents leaving the force in significant numbers, and the hiring process fails to bridge that gap. At the current hiring rate, approximately 113 applicants go through the process in order to hire a single agent or officer. This means CBP needs to have hundreds of thousands of people to apply just to meet their current needs. As a result, our national security is at risk and our economic growth is hindered. We need more manpower to properly secure the border, screen passengers at our international terminals who arrive from overseas, and facilitate cross-border commerce that powers our nation's economy. Addressing staffing shortages is a challenge for several reasons. For starters, it took more than 292 days and 12 distinct steps on average to hire a new officer or agent. And even with a newer expedited system called a hiring hub that's supposed to condense some of these steps, it takes an average of at least 160 days for people to complete this process. Now, I don't know anyone who can wait 290 days for a job, right? I mean, this is a significant amount of time. It's simply too much time, and we're losing far too many qualified applicants in the process because the current process is flawed. I'm the chairwoman of the Homeland Security, Border and Maritime Security Subcommittee. We've been engaging with CBP to speed up this process while ensure proper vetting for the last several years before I even became the subcommittee chairman. This is something that this committee has been working in a bipartisan way with the last administration in order to address this issue. The first bill that I had signed into law, my first bill ever in Congress in 2015, was the Border Jobs for Veterans Act. It directed them to fast-track our veterans through the process. But the implementation of the law and progress on streamlining the process has still been slow, and additional barriers remain. In 2010, Congress passed the Anti-Border Corruption Act. This law mandated that CBP law enforcement applicants undergo a pre-employment polygraph examination as part of a very long and laborious process. Absolutely no discretion was given to the agency, and as a result, the requirement is creating a significant, substantial staffing bottleneck. I want to make my position very clear. Everyone who applies to be a CBP officer, a Border Patrol agent, or an Air and Marine interdiction agent should be thoroughly vetted to ensure that they are not at risk for corruption or a cartel operative. They currently are, and this bill will not change that. After all, that is why this body requires polygraph examinations and background checks for agents in the first place. But we can and should make narrow, sensible, and straightforward allowances that allow CBP Commissioner to hire those already vetted and proven to be trustworthy due to service in uniform. They should be able to become agents with some discretion and in a timely manner. This bill expedites the hiring process for certain well-qualified applicants who have already proven themselves as law enforcement members or members of our military. The simple change would boost our national security with experienced manpower and provide good jobs for veterans of the military or other law enforcement agencies. The one and only goal of my bill is to stop the hemorrhaging of officers and agents. This legislation provides 3 very narrowly tailored exemptions to alleviate the immediate shortage of CBP officers and Border Patrol agencies or agents while maintaining the integrity of the hiring process. It provides discretion to the Commissioner of CBP, so he doesn't have to do this. It's only his discretion on a case-by-case basis to waive the polygraph for current state and local law enforcement officers who have already passed a polygraph examination, federal law enforcement officers who have already passed a stringent background investigation and served for 3 years, and veterans with at least 3 consecutive years in the military who have held a security clearance and passed stringent background checks. These narrow exemptions are purely discretionary, not mandatory. If there's something in an applicant's history or background that causes CBP concern, they can still use the polygraph exam to resolve those questions. These small changes will provide CBP with immediate relief so they're able to quickly yet judiciously hire officers and agents from a pool of qualified applicants who have already maintained the public's trust and put their lives on the line for our security and safety on a daily basis. Under this bill, the men and women in these 3 categories will be reviewed on an expedited basis while the agency pilots other changes to the way the polygraph examination is administered. This bipartisan bill passed the committee unanimously on a voice vote. I would like to add that the National Treasury Employees Union, NTEU, representing the officers who are stationed at the nation's land, sea, and airports of entry, fully support this bill, as well as the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who sees the potential positive impacts on cross-border trade and travel. And just before we got here, I found out that the Non-Commissioned Officers Association, which represents non-commissioned officers in our military, is also backing this bill because they realize it's going to help veterans with good jobs transitioning out of the military. In closing, I want to paint a picture of this for you. I served in the Air Force for 26 years. During that time, I had a top-secret SCI clearance with access to multiple compartmentalized programs. I was subject to the same background investigation, a SSBI, that these agents and officers will all undergo, even if given this waiver. I was entrusted to fly a $12 million aircraft, command a squadron worth over $300 million, manage millions of dollars in annual spending, run complex counterterrorism, close air support, search and rescue missions, you name it, in my time in the military. I had access to incredibly sensitive information. However, I've never taken a polygraph exam in all of those clearances. So if upon my retirement I wanted to be a line Border Patrol agent or serve at a port of entry, I wouldn't be qualified. I'd have to go through a polygraph because I wouldn't be trusted. That doesn't make any sense. There's thousands of veterans in similar circumstances that have already been trusted. And this is common sense bill that would help them. The mismatch of public trust doesn't make sense, and we need to give CBP commissioner this discretion to fully vet applicants in a way that makes the most sense to fill these positions while also preventing corruption. We began working to address this problem with the Obama administration. We've been working on it for several years. We've finally come to a narrow agreement about the way to address it, and I believe this bill is the first step in the right direction. Thanks again for allowing me the opportunity to testify.
Congresswoman, thank you very much. The needs of this nation, I believe, are right in line with, as you had mentioned, those who had served in law enforcement or the United States military. Is there anyone else that would be given this waiver, so to speak, this?
No, Mr. Chairman, there's three very distinct categories. I mentioned them already. Those who have served in local law enforcement and have already served for 3 years with no break in service, not currently under investigation or found guilty of misconduct, and have completed state or local law enforcement polygraph. That's the first category. Second category are those who have served as federal law enforcement officers. They've served for at least 3 years, no break in service, currently not under investigation or any misconduct, and hold an active security clearance. And the third group are military veterans that have served for at least 3 years, have had within the past 5 years a secret, top secret, or top secret SCI clearance, and have undergone within the past 5 years a robust background check. Those are the only three categories that are potentially up for this to be considered on a case-by-case basis by the commissioner.
Well, for the department to be able to attract those people and go through an expedited process seems to me to be something worthwhile. As you may know, I've been to Fort Huachuca, Arizona. I've been on the front line there in Arizona, and will tell you that the men and women who serve there every day need help. They need backup. They need more officers. They need experienced people.
Yeah.
They need people who can be trustworthy. They need people who are, quite honestly, the very best in the business. And I think for us to rapidly instruct and give the department the logistical support to do this through the what might be proper vetting and allowing them that option would be the right thing to do. And I applaud you for your not only hard work, but your good ideas. I know this is in your backyard. I know it is your yard, and I appreciate you paying attention to the men and women who daily protect this country. And thank you very much. Chairman Cole?
Well, I missed my distinguished colleague's testimony, but since I whip her, I think I'll get a first-hand account later, and whatever she brings, I'm for. So this is pretty easy for me, and I just want to thank my friend again, as all of us do, for her distinguished service. I thought about you and the other men and women that we have here over the memorial break quite a bit, quite frankly, and so thank you for your uninterrupted service to your country. With that, I yield back.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Slaughter?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. No questions.
Gentlewoman does not seek time. The gentleman from Georgia.
Mr. Chairman, I've been distracted during the testimony because I see a very intelligent-looking young woman back here on the back row in a purple bow, and
That's Samantha.
that's Samantha.
That is Samantha.
I don't know if Samantha realized as she was sitting through a Rules Committee testimony, which is ordinarily so riveting, that she was sitting with the very first female American pilot to fly into combat, the very first female squadron commander in the United States Air Force, sitting here with a leader in America who has been breaking glass ceilings her entire career. Lots of committee testimony that a beautiful, intelligent young woman could come and be a part of, but to be sitting here with folks who are paving the way for the next generation of American leaders is particularly special. I was watching Samantha while Representative McSally was testifying, and
Press in here with you as well.
Thank you, ma'am.
If Samantha were to turn her head, she would see the picture up there on the wall of the very first woman to ever chair the oldest and most distinguished committee of the United States House, sitting there. That reflects on Ms. Slaughter. I just wanted to express I have the same reservations that Mr. McGovern has. Anytime you talk about waiving polygraph tests, you start getting nervous, particularly in an area as important as this one is. I appreciate you making it clear with your own personal story that we are not talking about skimping on national security in any way, shape, or form. We're talking about embracing those folks who had. I also want to tell you how much I appreciate your describing this importance, not just in border security terms, but in border commerce terms. So often we have this conversation as if it is but one side of of that coin. So tremendously important to so many businesses in my district that we keep those lanes of commerce open. The law is what the law is, and we can't execute that law effectively without this. I had no idea the shortage was as dire as you described. No idea we'd been failing to meet those hiring commitments for the past 3 years, and no idea that the inability to get these applications processed required such a huge applicant pool just to meet our standards. So thank you for helping me to understand that today.
Oh, absolutely. And I mean, we've got a brand-new port of entry down in Nogales, Arizona, and we have lanes closed because we don't have the manning to keep them open, and that is impacting economic opportunity and cross-border commerce. And this is happening at ports of entry, land, sea, and air across the country, and this is such a critical part of why we've been working, again, with the last administration over the last 3 or 4 years to get to this place. This is a result of that. It's not a new idea. It's not something that's just come up. It has been a laborious effort, bipartisan with the last administration and now the current one to address this shortfall. And I want to make it clear, too, that each person, I mentioned there was a 12-step process, different than the other 12-step process, to get hired. You still have to go through a Tier 5 background check, which is the equivalent of an SSBI. For members of Congress, you guys just get background checks. For those of us who had to go through them in the military, we have to go through a very extensive, who we know, who live next to us, who do we go to school with, all your financial, like everything. It takes oftentimes years in the past, if you remember the backlog, to go through this very extensive background check. That still happens with every single candidate. The equivalent of what it takes to get a top secret clearance in the military is what they will still go through. It'll just be be able to have the ability to waive the polygraph. If they want to do it, if the commissioner wants to do it, he can do it on a case-by-case basis.
Not a partisan issue, a bipartisan issue, an American issue. Thank you so much for your leadership on this.
Thank you.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
If I could direct you back, you noticed this young, beautiful girl who was there. I wish I could claim she was from Texas. She's not, but she's with her dad, Matthew LeBrotten, and they, I believe, are from Massachusetts. And they were visiting here today, and Mrs. Cheney brought them in here, and I had a chance, I'll confess, to get my picture with Samantha. So I'm doing well today, and I'm sure the gentleman from Georgia will catch up with me soon as this meeting is over with. We're delighted that you're here, Samantha. Gentleman from Massachusetts.
I knew she seemed like somebody of great intelligence, and I know.
Well, there's
know
a
why,
reason why I said she's from Massachusetts.
Right,
She's
I figured that out.
bright,
Thank you.
charming.
Absolutely. But I don't have any question. I just ask unanimous consent to insert in the record, because I think it's worth putting in, a letter signed by dozens and dozens and dozens of faith-based human rights groups and civil rights groups opposed to this bill.
Without objection, we'll enter those in the
back.
record. The gentleman yields back his time. By the way, I would like to enter into the record from the U.S. Chamber, Homeland Security, the Assistant Secretary for Legislative Affairs, and finally, from the National Treasury Employees Union, Anthony M. Reardon, National President, in support of Congresswoman McSally's bill. Without objection, that'll be in the record. The gentleman from Louisville, Texas, Dr. Michael Burgess.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank our witness for being here today. Mr. Chairman, Monday and Tuesday of last week, I was down on the lower Rio Grande Valley sector in Texas. Like Arizona, we share part of an international border. And the men and women of Customs and Border Patrol at Weslaco Station and McAllen Station I've had an opportunity to visit with them before. It looks a little different down there today, quite honestly, than it did even as recently as last August. The vast numbers of unaccompanied alien children and family units that were coming across the Rio Grande last summer have sharply reduced, and for that I am grateful. I do recognize that things can change and things do change, and for that reason, I'm certainly supportive of the effort to increase the number of men and women we have working for Customs and Border Patrol. Again, having had the chance to spend a couple of days down there and go on their patrols with them, understand the very difficult and sometimes dangerous nature of their work. We can't thank them enough for the service that they provide to our country. I am grateful that the situation has improved over the last time that I was there, and I certainly credit for the administration for taking the appropriate actions that have created that environment. But at the same time, I recognize that things can change and things do change. So this bill before us today is timely because it will increase the number of personnel that are available. And thank the gentlelady for her service, and yield back to the chairman.
Thank the gentleman for his comments for the men and women who support the United States of America and our safety. The gentleman does not seek time. Judge Hastings does not seek time. Is there any other member of the committee that would seek time, knowing the gentlewoman, as I've caught her, with unprepared, but the gentlewoman, would she choose to add any comments about the great Samantha who is visiting us today? The gentlewoman's recognized.
I just want to say Samantha said she would be available afterwards for a photo line with any other members of the committee who would like to get their photo with her as well. So, but thank you very much for your kind words, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. The gentlewoman yields back her time. Samantha, the opportunity for you to be at the Rules Committee to see our young Congresswoman from Arizona, who is quite honestly a stalwart in the United States Air Force, who has gladly joined other veterans. For instance, Congressman Sam Johnson from this body as a fighter pilot is an exciting young thing. I don't know what your future holds, but let the record reflect we were delighted that you're with us today. Ms. McSally, thank you very much for taking time to be with us, and we'll consider your bill now as we move forward, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll be first in the photo line with Samantha.
Yes, ma'am. Is there any other member of the body that would seek to give testimony to the bill offered by Ms. McSally that is under the title of H.R. 2213, the Anti-Border Corruption Reauthorization Act of 2017? Seeing no member that would wish to be heard, this will close the hearing portion of H.R. 2213. We've now opened up the hearing for H.R. 10, Financial Choice Act of 2017. The young chairman from Dallas, Texas, Mr. Henseling, would be present. The gentleman, Mr. Kildee, representing the committee, would also be present. We're delighted both of you are here. Without objection, Mr. Chairman, we have asked and provided you the ability to provide whatever you brought in writing be entered in the record, and the young chairman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Chairman Sessions, Ranking Member Slaughter, members of the Rules Committee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on H.R. 10, the Financial Choice Act. When Dodd-Frank was passed nearly 7 years ago, Americans were promised that it would lift the economy, and instead we have seen the slowest, weakest recovery in the last 70 years. We were promised that Dodd-Frank would end bailouts. Instead, Dodd-Frank promises more taxpayer-funded bailouts for the Wall Street banks that unelected bureaucrats decide are too big to fail. We were promised that by turning more control over our economy to Washington, that Dodd-Frank would make our financial system more secure. Yet with Dodd-Frank, the big banks have become even bigger. We have lost more than 1,700 community banks and credit unions, and corporate bond markets are seeing historic levels of illiquidity and volatility. This is not a more secure financial system, Mr. Chairman. That's increasing risk to our financial system and setting the stage for the next crisis. Even the former director of President Obama's National Economic Council admitted that Dodd-Frank has not made large banks any safer than they were before Dodd-Frank. Instead of helping working families recover and achieve financial independence, researchers at the University of Maryland have concluded that Dodd-Frank, quote, triggered a substantial redistribution of credit from middle-class households to wealthy households, unquote. Indeed, the Federal Reserve tells us that when Dodd-Frank is fully phased in, 1/3 of Black and Hispanic borrowers who were able to buy a home before the crisis will no longer be able to do so. Consumers who could depend on free checking at their banks no longer can because of Dodd-Frank. Instead, consumers find their average monthly fees have tripled. For all the rhetoric that Dodd-Frank is a, quote, consumer protection law, the reality is that with Dodd-Frank, consumers are paying more and they're getting less. And for all the rhetoric that somehow Dodd-Frank is a Wall Street reform law, Wall Street CEOs openly declare their big banks are among the biggest beneficiaries of Dodd-Frank. They've said Dodd-Frank's complexity and regulations help big banks maintain a competitive advantage over smaller banks. No doubt this is one of the reasons why many Wall Street CEOs say publicly that they don't want Dodd-Frank to be repealed. Community and banks and credit unions, however, tell us something far, far different. Members from across the nation have heard from their local community bankers and credit union leaders about the very real harm Dodd-Frank is causing Main Street. We see this especially when it comes to small businesses, America's job-creating engine. Just listen to the former director of President Obama's Small Business Administration, who lamented the fact that Dodd-Frank's heavy-handed regulation on community banks, quote, are getting in the way of their ability to make small business loans, unquote. No wonder job-creating entrepreneurial activity is stuck at a generational low. Only 6 new banks have been chartered since Dodd-Frank became law. Only 6. It used to be, Mr. Chairman, over 200 a year. Thanks to Dodd-Frank, too many garages are full of old cars instead of new startup small businesses. This is unacceptable. It's time for bailouts to end. It's time to help small businesses on Main Street. It's time to make Washington and Wall Street accountable. It's time for the Financial Choice Act. Financial Choice Act ends bailouts so that Washington can never again pick taxpayers' pockets and hand the money over to large banks. It ends too big to fail once and for all. It makes our financial system safer and helps avoid another crisis by replacing taxpayer funds with loss-absorbing private capital. Far more capital than either Dodd-Frank or the International Basel Accords require. It creates a true cop on the beat to protect consumers. We will have a consumer agency fully focused on enforcing consumer protection laws instead of losing precious time making up the laws with no accountability or constitutional authority. The Financial Choice Act will ensure that the shadow regulators come out from the shadows and that the government will be once again accountable to we the people. The Financial Choice Act holds Wall Street accountable with the toughest penalties in history for fraud and insider trading. Instead of trying to grow our economy the old way with top-down regulations, the Financial Choice Act will unleash a wave of capital formation to grow America's Main Street economy. And the Financial Choice Act offers desperately needed regulatory relief for our community banks and credit unions. That's why community banks and credit unions who don't always agree, Mr. Chairman, agree in supporting the Financial Choice Act. In fact, the Congressional Budget Office confirms that the regulatory relief in the Financial Choice Act will benefit community financial institutions and that big Wall Street banks cannot or will not meet the bill's criteria for significant regulatory relief. In addition, the Congressional Budget Office scores the Financial Choice Act as a significant cost savings that will cut the deficit by $33.6 billion. No surprise here, when you end bailouts, you save taxpayers' money. Hardworking taxpayers want Congress to end the bailouts. They want Congress to hold both Washington and Wall Street accountable. They want Congress to make our financial system safer, stronger, and more secure. And they want a healthier economy with equal opportunity for all, and that's what they will get with the Financial Choice Act. The Financial Choice Act is significant legislation. It is the product of over 145 hearings held by the Financial Services Committee since January of 2011. And the committee's approval of the bill last month came after 3 days of debate during a markup where the minority offered 19 amendments. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, I thank you for the opportunity to testify today. I look forward to answering any questions that you may have.
Chairman Hensley, thank you very much. Mr. Cooley, we're delighted that you're here with us. Please make sure your green light is on and the gentleman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Slaughter, for this hearing and for allowing me to speak on H.R. 10. This bill, which we refer to as the Wrong Choice Act, would eliminate the most important consumer protections and safeguards that Congress put in place after the 2008 financial crisis. This bill, premised on extreme ideological notions that puts Wall Street ahead of Main Street and the American consumer. This gives Wall Street yet another handout while ignoring the needs of hardworking Americans. It takes us back to those days of Wall Street predatory lending and profiting on the backs of consumers, the same reckless behavior that brought our economy to the brink of collapse just about a decade ago. Have we really forgotten just how much pain the Great Recession caused so many American families? Let's take a moment to remind ourselves. 8 million Americans lost their jobs. 11 million people lost their homes through foreclosures. American families lost trillions of dollars in wealth. Unemployment shot up to 10%. Many people continue to suffer permanently lower income and job prospects. The Great Recession hit my home state of Michigan especially hard. Our state's unemployment rate was at almost 14% at the height of the financial crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Michiganders lost their jobs, were evicted from their homes, saw their retirement savings wiped out. This body should not forget the pain and suffering that many Americans still experience. We can't have amnesia about the impacts of the financial crisis or be swayed by alternative facts regarding this bill. Here are the actual facts. Wall Street reform and other democratic policies have provided our country the strongest consumer protections in our history. And I understand that obviously when it comes to any aspect of our economy, we can do better. And I do believe that Democrats and Republicans on the committee believe that there are ways we can improve the regulatory environment, but this is a step in the wrong direction. Since the enactment of Dodd-Frank Wall Street reform, our economy has experienced growth, 85 consecutive months of private sector job growth, adding 16 million jobs. The unemployment rate is now at 4.3%. Wages are not rising fast enough, for sure, but we are making some progress, and there's more that we can do to grow our economy, but this bill does not help. Bank lending has increased by 75%. At the same time, banks set an all-time record of $171 billion in profits. And community banks' loan growth has been faster than bigger banks, actually. Now, is there more we can do? For sure. But they have been able to make loans supporting residential, commercial, industrial, small business loans. It's happening because healthy banks are playing by a fair set of rules. Americans know that this wrong choice bill is the wrong direction for our country. Let me briefly highlight just a few of the reasons why. First, in the words of our own chairman, who obviously has spent a great deal of effort on this legislation, the bill, quote, functionally terminates, unquote, the Consumer Bureau by ending its authority to protect Americans from abusive and predatory practices by banks, lenders, student loan companies. The bill strips away the Consumer Bureau's independent funding, hides its consumer complaint database, stops it from supervising Wall Street's largest banks. In my own state alone, 20,000 complaints were submitted to the Consumer Bureau to protect customers just since 2011. So far, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau has returned $12 billion to 29 million customers. The Wrong Choice Act would gut this agency and work against those important gains. It's also unacceptable to create a loophole specifically for payday lenders and auto title lenders to again harm low and moderate income Americans by preventing the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau from setting appropriate safeguards. Mr. Chairman, should Congress want to make it impossible for the Consumer Bureau to protect Americans from predatory lending and fraud, the Wrong Choice Act also hurts seniors and Americans saving for retirement by repealing the requirement that financial advisors act in the best interest of their clients. This one provision alone would cause the loss of an estimated $17 billion a year in retirement savings for Americans due to bad advice from advisors providing advice not in the consumer's best interest. The Wrong Choice Act also makes it harder for the Financial Stability Oversight Council to identify and mitigate threats to our financial system, and it would abolish the Office of Financial Research, the entity charged with informing that council about emerging risks in our financial system. The bill would have the effect of politicizing regulators by eliminating their independent funding. Oddly, after Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac failed in 2008, Congress specifically identified that one of the reasons for their failure was that the Federal Housing Finance Agency's predecessor had become weak through inadequate funding. We fixed that in the Housing and Economic Recovery Act, but this bill returns us to the same failed system that we had before. It's one of the lessons we have to heed. At the same time, along those same lines, the Wrong Choice Act prevents the Federal Reserve, which played a critical role in stabilizing housing and financial markets during the crisis, from making independent decisions about monetary policy, jeopardizing the American economy, jeopardizing American jobs. Financial regulators would be subject to significant bureaucratic hurdles, including when to bring enforcement actions. As an example, regulators would not be able to take immediate action against those committing fraud. Instead, the Wrong Choice Act waters down regulators' ability to quickly go after bad actors, forcing them to conduct costly and timely, time-consuming cost-benefit analysis before taking any action. Why would we rig the system in favor of those defrauding those hardworking Americans? This bill is even more extreme when it comes to the Securities and Exchange Commission's authority to stop fraud. The act would tie the Commission's hands by prohibiting it from banning executives and directors who have violated laws governing the financial industry. And I'm sure members of this committee, as we have received numerous letters of opposition that have been sent to us by experts, shareholders, everyday Americans. In fact, as I was walking in, if you don't mind, Mr. Chairman, I was given a letter that I would ask to have entered into the record. I won't read the letter in its entirety, but it's from the Veterans of Foreign Wars, the Adjutant General, Robert E. Wallace. I'll read the final paragraph of this letter without, if the chairman would mind entering the entire letter into the record.
Without objection, I'll be into the record.
The final paragraph reads, if enacted, the Financial Choice Act of 2017 would put those who have taken an oath to defend this country and our way of life in financial harm's way. In light of this, and on behalf of the nearly 1.7 million members of the Veterans of Foreign Wars and its auxiliary, I call on you to oppose H.R. 10. As House Democrats on the committee oppose this bill in committee, we oppose it now. We reject this Wrong Choice Act, and we ask all members to consider the full implications of the enactment of this legislation on the American economy and on the American consumer. I appreciate the chairman yielding me time, and I yield back.
Mr. Kildee, thank you very much. Your testimony before this committee, just as the young chairman from Dallas, Texas, is important not only for us to understand your ideas, the men and women who sit on financial services, who daily not only study these issues, but are in touch with what I believe is consumers as well as the industry, and that's important. Mr. Chairman, I'm from Dallas, Texas also, and I have become aware of and been aware of for quite some time the inability for financial institutions to have enough money to lend. It seems on one hand that the government, perhaps under Dodd-Frank, required greater reserves by financial institutions where they put money that would be available to lend to people in some reserve, and yet on the other hand, the types of loans and the ways that people were looked at, the requirements for getting loans became far more stringent. And perhaps this was the correct thing to do at a time when our country was undergoing a financial strain. It seems like to me that it caused a backlash that kept families, kept consumers, and kept people who needed to get loans, who needed to get an opportunity to work, who needed college graduates who were trying to move out of college and into their own homes. It seemed like it put a real crimp on not just those individuals, but really overall the economy from a Dallas, Texas perspective. You have the opportunity to see a more global, what I would say, United States view. And I think this is what caused you to wait several years in your intellectual capacity as the chairman to develop ideas, to put them to test. Some 145 hearings that your committee held to actually listen to consumers, to hear from people. Tell me what you saw. I know what I saw in Dallas. Tell me what you saw, and is that seemingly a scenario that you could confirm or add to?
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Absolutely. We have way too much capital that is sitting on the sidelines of this economy. And what we know is that working Americans haven't gotten a pay increase, frankly, since Dodd-Frank was enacted. Their savings have not been replenished since the financial crisis. And so this is an economy that is underperforming. I hear from my friends on the other side of the aisle that somehow 1.5% to 2% economic growth is just fine. But you know what? It's not fine for the lady who works at the UPS plant in Mesquite, Texas, in the 5th District. It's not okay for the farmer in Mineola who's having trouble making ends meet and dreams of sending that first child to college. This is a nation that in the post-war era has averaged over 3% economic growth. But Dodd-Frank has imposed greater regulation on this economy than all Obama-era regulations combined. It is that bad. And so it puts capital on the sidelines. It's one of the reasons why small business lending has not rebounded since the crisis. It's one of the reasons why entrepreneurship is at a generational low. And so it is our small banks that lend to our small businesses. It is our small businesses which are the job-creating engine in America. And we're losing a small bank or credit union a day, and they're not dying of natural causes, Mr. Chairman. They are dying of Dodd-Frank's regulatory burden. They are being crushed by it. And so if we want to get this economy moving again, what we have to do is we have to replace this. We have to replace its complexity with simplicity. We have to replace its bailouts for banks for bankruptcy for failed banks. We have to replace taxpayer capital with private capital, and that's what the Financial Choice Act does. It says if you will have a stronger balance sheet than is required by either Dodd-Frank or required by the International Basel Accords, what we call a 10% simple leverage ratio, you get to have a Dodd-Frank off-ramp. Mr. Chairman, 98% of all financial institutions that had a 10% simple leverage ratio survived the second worst financial crisis in America's history. And so that's what we want. You can make a case after the financial crisis that capital was insufficient, but I don't think you can make the case that it was insufficiently complex. Dodd-Frank has made it more complex, and when we talk about the hearings and the years, it's now obvious. Dodd-Frank broke all of its promises. It promised it would lift the economy, and instead we're limping along at 1.5% to 2% economic growth. It promised it would end bailouts, and cynically, it codified them into law. It promised it would make our economy more stable, but instead the big banks are bigger. What could be a greater indictment of Dodd-Frank than the fact that the big banks are bigger and the small banks are fewer? Finally, it said it would help our consumers. Well, then why has free checking been cut in half at banks? Why are bank fees up? Why are credit cards 15%? Why are there 15% fewer credit card offerings, and why do they cost 2 to 3 percentage points more? Why is it that many credit-worthy borrowers are having to pay $500 more for an auto loan? Why is it that mortgages are harder to come by and they cost hundreds of more dollars to close? If that is consumer protection, God save us from Dodd-Frank's consumer protection, because it's harming consumers, Mr. Chairman.
Well, Mr. Chairman, to me, you described Dodd-Frank as a concrete life preserver, and I think it was. And it did not help out, did not add the buoyancy. In fact, I think it worked in reverse that. And I thank the gentleman very much. Mr. Kildee, I'm delighted that you were here with us today. Gentleman from Oklahoma. Young chairman's recognized.
Thank you very much, and I want to welcome both our guests, the two members, frankly, I admire greatly. It was my friend and I arrived here at the same time. We were friends a long time before we got here. I think he's been one of the most distinguished members of Congress during my tenure. I mean that with great sincerity. My friend from Michigan, always on the right side on every Native American issue. And I was really...
But you're suggesting perhaps not on this one?
Pleased and, pleased and proud to work with you on the Flint issue when you finally, so, I mean, these are two really exceptional members that we have. I'll make a couple of comments. We all, or quite a few of us on this panel lived through of course, we all lived through, but lived through in Congress, the Great Recession. And that was an extremely difficult decision as to what to do. And by the way, Mr. Chairman, you were exceptional today on Morning Joe. Let me just add that for the record as well. I saw that green tie and thought I would follow suit. But, in that particular instance, it's interesting to me because we had bipartisan coalition for the quote-unquote bailout, TARP, Troubled Asset Relief Program, and a bipartisan coalition against it. And I came down, I followed, frankly, the lead of our current speaker, my good friend Tom Coburn, who was in the Senate, our junior senator, in favor of that. And I don't consider it a bailout, frankly. I consider it because the banks honestly paid for it. We ended up making billions of dollars. But I agree 100% with my chairman here that we adopted in Dodd-Frank the absolute wrong remedy and aimed it at the wrong people. I used to like to say when I was at home, I don't think anybody in Oklahoma, certainly nobody in any Oklahoma financial institution, had anything to do with the collapse that we went through. It was centered in Wall Street and centered in large banks. And yet the punishment, the real punishment, was not, quote unquote, the bailout, which the banks did pay for. It was this legislation, in my view, Dodd-Frank, that came out of the crisis itself. And I'll give you two examples from small banks in my district. One is called Vision Bank in Ada, Oklahoma. It's about a $140 million bank. A gentleman there that's the president's named Jim Hamby. He's been a good friend of mine for a couple of decades. And I remember not too long after this walking into this Main Street bank of $140 million and him showing me a line of 7 cubicles, 2 on each side, 14 people. And he said, Tom, these are the people that I had to hire because of Dodd-Frank. They don't make me a dime. They don't save me a dime. And then he gave me story after story of how hard it was to make loans for homes, how difficult it was to help young entrepreneurs that were struggling. He said, these are people I know. I mean, I can make character loans. I can't do that anymore, basically, here. And so it's a really, really difficult thing for us in this community. It's slowed down our recovery and our growth. And then afterwards, I went to an even smaller bank, a place called Allen, Oklahoma. Allen, Oklahoma has 1,000 people in it. Most important person in that town is named Debbie Reinhardt. She's the president of the family bank, and she worked herself up from being a teller to finally the president. I walked into her office one day, and there were stacks of paper like this high all around her. And she said, this is what I hate about my job. I used to be able to be a banker. Now I'm a regulator almost every single day. This is the kind of person that makes this little town go round. If you walk down Main Street with her, she knows every person she sees. You know, it's the only bank in this little community. She feels very strongly, obviously, if this bank went the way of so many other family-owned bank and small community banks that my friend mentioned, there's not going to be another bank in that town. Nobody's going to put one in a town of 1,000 residents, and they're going to have to drive 30 miles to the nearest, somewhat larger city and get their banking there, and nobody will know them like she knows them. Nobody will be able. So I see this over and over and over again. I remember when we were discussing this legislation was passed, and there was some chagrin on our side about, well, we'll be cast as the tools of the big banks, which I guess we're being cast on again. I think it's exactly the opposite. And I remember discussing this in a deputy whip meeting, and there was always a political dimension to the discussion, and our good friend from Virginia, Mr. Cantor, turned to me and said, "What do you think?" I said, "It's going to be the easiest no vote I ever cast in my life. I cannot find one person associated with a credit union or a bank or a financial institution in my district that's in favor of this legislation." And they've been pretty accurate in their predictions as to what it would do. And I think my friend, the chairman, has been very accurate in describing them. So I don't have a lot of questions here because while I think you're both tremendous members, and I actually trust you both greatly individually, and I know you know your subject, I know you know your committee, I don't have to, frankly, listen to the arguments because I've heard it from the people that have to live with this thing in my own district every day. And I've heard it for 7 years. So this is going to be one of the happiest votes I ever cast in my time here to deal with this. And, in terms of the consumer protection, I'm sorry, I have a hard time with anything that's not under the supervision of Congress that consumes billions of dollars that are not appropriated, is not subject to our authorization. I think it's, frankly, unconstitutional in my view. But regardless of that, this has been, an egregious piece of legislation, in my opinion. I want to applaud you, Mr. Chairman, for bringing this legislation to the floor. I feel very, very strongly about this because when I see a regulatory scheme that I think costs people opportunity, the opportunity to build their business, the opportunity to buy their home, the opportunity to get a loan in a reasonable time, the opportunity for a banker to actually use the personal knowledge he has of the individual client sitting across from him or her to the advantage to try and help that person, then I think we've got a really defective piece of legislation here. I like particularly in this legislation your feature that you put in that, hey, you want out a lot of these regulations? Great. You just maintain a higher capital ratio on hand. That's a great idea. So don't come whining to us. Just go ahead and, if you can put yourself in the position that we can trust you, then that's fine. But again, I think you're freeing up the entrepreneurial engine of the country here in ways that are much more profound than what we normally do up here. So I want to commend my friend. I want to commend his friends. And again, I know the opposition's principled. I admire that. And again, I lived through big banks gone bad and had to cast a vote I didn't very much like to cast at the time. But again, the remedy that came out of this situation was all out of proportion to the problem and largely, in my view, hit the wrong people. And so this is a step in the right direction. It'll be interesting to me to see in the Senate what happens, because I think if our constituents, at least in my part of the world, listen, or if our members listen to their constituents, this is a very easy vote to cast for most of us. Most of us don't represent gigantic banks. We certainly have substantial banks in the state of Oklahoma, but nothing that would pose a systemic threat to the economy of the United States. And I think federal government has proven it actually knows how to wind down banks like that to get in problem and do them in a responsible way. But to force them to pay the price for crimes they didn't commit, so to speak, and I think that's what this bill has done, has been incredibly unfair. So I want to thank again my friend, and didn't mean to take this much time, Mr. Chairman, but this is something I really do feel strongly about, and thank you for bringing this measure before us. Yield back.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much. Mrs. Slaughter.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to request that Ms. Captor, who is part of this panel, are you not?
We're here with another bill.
You're listed here
Okay.
on financial services. You're not here? What is she doing? All right. Sorry about that, Miss Capter. You can just sit right there and watch us.
But she's got a good seat next to Walter
Because
Jones.
this is a great day.
I want to say, ranking member, I'm just so happy to be recognized with my colleague here, Mr. Jones.
Yeah, well, it's nice to see the two of you. I feel like I've fallen down a rabbit hole. I mean, I didn't realize how bad things were in Texas and other places. I've had at least 3 new community banks open in my congressional district in the last 5 years. Real estate's doing fine. Everybody's getting mortgages. It's a seller's market. And it's really an astonishing. I had no idea that you all were so bad off.
Yes, ma'am.
But anyway, let's discuss it here. This bill, as Mr. Kildee pointed out so nicely, should be called the Wrong Choice Act. I'm proud that I brought the Dodd-Frank Wall Street Reform Bill to the floor of the House as the chairwoman of this committee 7 years ago. And I'd like to remind everyone here what we've seen in the years since this law was enacted. Over 80 consecutive months of private sector job growth. The unemployment rate has dropped to 4.3%. Business lending has increased by 75%. That's pretty close to 100. And the industry set an all-time record for profits last year, which Mr. Kildee pointed out as $171 billion. So what's the problem? What is it in this thing that offends you so greatly? And things are selling, businesses are borrowing, banks are making money, and you want to take this away. Is it just the consumer protection part that offends you so much? What you're doing here would gut all the important protections and reforms that help us to achieve these spectacular gains. Have you forgotten what happened during the financial crisis? 11 million homes were lost with no recourse whatever. Mortgages were underwater. Unemployment surged to 10%, and $13 trillion in wealth was lost virtually overnight. Do you remember that's why we did this bill? Anybody recall that at all? That we thought we needed to do something so that it wouldn't happen again. And here we are 7 years later, everybody's forgotten that, and we're going to do it again and let big banks do whatever they please. We didn't even learn anything from Wells Fargo. So you're ignoring the past and you're endangering the future of millions of Americans. Dismantling the law will force consumers to go it alone against Wall Street. And when you consider, I believe that Mr. Kildee said that they'd gotten something like, would you repeat again the amount of money the consumers have been able to get back that belonged to them because of this Consumer Federation?
29 million Americans, over $12 billion.
12 billion?
Yes.
I think that's pretty substantial to the people who were able to get that money back and who, frankly, after this is gone, will have literally no place to go. The next thing you know, we get rid of this one, and we tell people they can't have health care and they can't have this, and education's getting out of sight. I'm not sure. I wouldn't exactly consider this a great leap forward. So I have no questions. Thank you.
Gentleman has no questions and yields back her time. I'd like to direct the committee, if I can, and I'm going to go out of order here, to recognize the gentleman from the state of Washington who we've missed for a few weeks, and I'd like to welcome him, the gentleman, Mr. Newhouse. Dan, we are delighted to see you with admiration, respect, and love. This committee missed you. We recognize what your service means to us, and we offer our admiration to you, but I want to yield the gentleman the time at this time for him to ask questions or however he'd like to respond. We're delighted that you're back, Dan. Gentleman's recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the going out of order. Let me just say you all look as lovely and handsome as I remember. It's good to be back. Hopefully, I will have a little normalcy take over in my life. As you know, it's been, if you can imagine, it's been a very difficult few weeks. Yes, so I hope none of you have to go through that. But if you do, I will be there with you to help you as much as I can. So I wished I had come to hear more of the testimony. I did catch a little bit of Mr. Kildee's. I appreciate that. I've heard the chairman speak before on this issue. If I could just talk a little bit about the issue before us, it would probably be easier for me instead of continuing in the vein of my
Yes, sir.
earlier comments, because I probably wouldn't be able to continue that. Let me just associate myself, if I could, with the good gentleman from Oklahoma on some of the things that he said. I represent rural Washington State. My biggest city is just under 100,000 people, and there's only one of them. I've got cities that range from a few hundred to a few thousand. There's a lot of them that are in the 10,000 population bracket. And there's a lot of small community banks, a lot of small credit union institutions that people depend on in those small communities. And I'm sure it's the same in upstate New York as it is in central Washington, that one of the biggest complaints that I've gotten from those institutions since I started serving in Congress has been the necessity for them to follow all kinds of rules and regulations and the cost and the time that they're having to incur because of what they have told me they feel they are being penalized for something that they did not commit, a sin that they did not commit. And what's that doing? It's having a detrimental impact on those small communities, those small businesses, those small farms that depend on these local banks, local credit unions for their daily activities. And so if this legislation will help remove some of that burden and make the banking community better able to service those small communities, and by golly, I'm all for it, and I appreciate the effort of Mr. Chairman Hensarling to be able to bring this forward, and look forward to supporting it on the floor. And Mr. Chairman, Chairman Sessions, I appreciate you recognizing my absence, and I look forward to continuing to work alongside each and every one of you. So thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. Well, let me say this, in the coming days, I think you'll recognize the admiration, respect, and love, prayers and conditions of return that we recognize. And I'm really proud of you. I want you to know that this committee as a whole several times not only recognized your circumstances, but affirmed its respect and appreciation for you in a time I hope you needed it, and I hope the prayers went that way also to you. A lot of people are really proud of you, sir.
We needed them, and we got them, and thank you very much for,
Yes, sir.
for that support.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you very much. Mr. McGovern.
Well, thank you, and I too want to extend our condolences to Mr. Newhouse and say we're happy that you're back, and but you and your family will be in our prayers. And I will be quick, Mr. Chairman, because I know the time is getting short here. But Mr. Kildee read the last paragraph of the Veterans of Foreign Wars of the United States statement into the record. I just think it's important just to read a couple of the other paragraphs here. It says, an independent report released earlier this month revealed that of the 44,000 total complaints filed with the CFPB by military veterans and service members, 32% stem from debt collection abuses. Other complaints filed range from issues related to loans, credit reporting, and VA mortgages. In response to these complaints, the CFPB proactively sought ways to tighten regulations in order to disrupt lenders who engage in such practices and create increased protections for those who have given so much. As a grateful nation, we must protect the financial well-being of our service members and veterans so they can focus on defeating our enemies or successfully transitioning back to civilian life. This includes strengthening, not weakening, enforcement of Service Members Civil Relief Act. And it goes on to talk about how this is they oppose HR 10. I just think it's a very powerful statement from the VFW. I hope all my colleagues will reflect on it. And I don't the only other thing, I just noticed the Statement of Administration Policy, and Mr. Hensling, I don't know if you've seen it, but it kind of ends strangely. First, it says, the administration thanks Chairman Jeb Hensling for his leadership on this important issue addressed by the Financial Choice Act. That's a nice compliment. And it says, the administration supports passage of the substitute amendment to H.R. 10 as a necessary and important step in moving financial reform legislation through Congress. But then it says, upon passage, the administration looks forward to working with the Senate on arriving at a final piece of legislation. I guess my only question to you is, do you know what the administration wants to change about your legislation?
Well, I appreciate the question. I know that currently they are undertaking a review under executive orders that have not yet been published. And so I think they have 3 different tranches where they are reviewing the entirety of our financial services laws, and I think those will come out in the weeks and months to come.
It just struck me as kind of strange. It doesn't sound like a ringing endorsement of the bill that we're talking about here, but let's put it this way, it's not stranger than his tweets, so, I mean, that's a positive thing, but from your point of view. But anyway, I think it's a bad idea, Mr. Chairman, and in the interest of time, I'll yield back my time.
Thank you very much. Without objection, I would enter into the record the SAP that the gentleman has just spoken about, and want to thank the gentleman for recognizing the leadership of the gentleman from Dallas, Texas, Mr. Hensley. Gentleman, use back time. Thank you very much. Gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yes, sir.
I read that last statement, too, and I didn't think it sounded odd at all. I thought it sounded traditional. You know, if we're going to get things done around here, the House is going to have to take a leadership role. And I will tell you, this is nothing short of a force of personality of the chairman of the Financial Services Committee for getting this thing done. This was one of the biggest bills that has ever passed the Congress. As the chairman pointed out, more regulations in this one bill than the rest of the Obama administration combined. Of course it's going to be hard to have this conversation again. I remember reading a Time magazine article, Mr. Chairman, back in December of 2013, and they were talking about the very first bank to have been chartered under a U.S. charter in the last 3 years. It was the Bank of Bird in Hand. It was an Amish-led bank. They were talking about how the drive-through had to be wide enough for a wagon to come through. You had to be able to bring your carriage through. That was the first bank in years to have been chartered. That was December of 2013. How many banks have been chartered in the interim? Did you say 6 total?
A half a dozen.
Half a dozen. 2014, 2015, 2016, 2017. 5 additional banks chartered in this country. I went back and looked to want to recognize Mr. Kildee. He and I have been working together to fight for some American manufacturing jobs that have been disadvantaged by Chinese dumping in the American market. And to suggest that we don't work for workers in a bipartisan way, of course, is just nonsense. We do it all the time, and I'm grateful to him for his leadership. But my reading, Mr. Kildee, is that in this new millennia, domestic deposits in these giant banks, in fact, the top 5 banks in the country, has doubled. That too big to fail is now too bigger to fail. And I am losing. I'm glad the ranking member has new community banks coming online in her district. I have counties with no local banks left. Is that not a challenge in Minnesota? The consolidation in the giant banks. We all agree too big to fail is a problem. What's the answer in Michigan about what happens as this consolidation takes place and local banks are squeezed?
Well, I mean, I think we do have to recognize that there are problems in the market, and this is where I think Democrats on the committee have had some frustration. We don't get to vote for part of this bill. We don't get to look at it and say, look, there are ways we need to address the regulatory environment so that we're really adopting more of a risk-based approach and try to encourage the streamlining of the regulatory environment. The concern that I have, and I'm only speaking for myself, is that in order to move forward on any of that, most of which I think is problematic, but some of it could be helpful, we've got to accept essentially throwing away what we think is a really essential element of Dodd-Frank and of the entire regulatory environment, and that is a cop on the beat dedicated entirely to supporting consumers. So I acknowledge that no bill is perfect, no act that we've ever passed through this Congress is not something that could be changed. But we do have to think about where we were before this crisis and whether or not this legislation takes us back, substantially takes us back to that same place. I believe it does. But that doesn't mean that there aren't problems that we ought to address. In this notion that we ought to find a way to help smaller banks, regional banks, but especially those community banks that have relationships. I'm there. In fact, I have been having some success in working with one of the members of our committee, Mr. Barr, to try to come up with a way to allow those lenders, those small lenders that have relationships and who are willing to offer mortgages and hold them in portfolio to provide some relief. I have a suggestion that we might want to think about the products that might be subject to that. We didn't quite get there in the space of this legislation, but that would be one tangible step that I think we could do in a bipartisan fashion.
I wish that I'd gotten a chance to see that consumer cop on the beat in a way that it was led by the people's house, elected representatives, instead of an unaccountable single-member entity. Undeniably, if you want to give an agency a lot of power, put one person in charge of it, give them unlimited funding, and tell them they have no boss to be held accountable to. I just run for Congress at that time. It just disappoints me about us that at the time that bill was moving through, I know there was a lot of crisis going on, that we believed that when it comes to protecting consumers, we wouldn't do it. That we didn't believe enough in ourselves that we would fund an agency to go after those folks. I listened to that VFW letter. I listened to the paragraph you read. I listened to what Jim McGovern read. I'm looking at the chairman right here. I'm not going to be able to find a military family in my district that's being taken advantage of, that I could knock on the chairman's door and he would help me rattle every cage in the country in order to serve that family. So I know we could have done that together. I know we believe in that together. And I wonder if we would not be having a different conversation today if this body had believed more in us and our accountability to folks back home and was less distrustful that we would get that done. I've come to know these men and women, and I believe we would. And candidly, I'm looking forward to the chance for us to get back to work serving those families. And I appreciate that opportunity, Mr. Chairman. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back his time. Thank you very much. The gentleman from Florida does not seek time. The gentleman from Alabama is recognized.
Yes, if I may ask the chairman a couple of questions, because it's been some time since I was involved in banking law, and I may have had some changes and things. As I recall, back when I used to do banking law, the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation regulated state-chartered banks with regard to compliance with federal consumer protection laws. Is that still the case?
No.
It is?
Essentially, now, what has happened post-Dodd-Frank is the responsibilities of enforcing roughly 24 major consumer protection laws that predated the CFPB have now been given to the CFPB. And so most of these authorities have been stripped from the prudential regulators, including the FDIC.
Okay, so prior to Dodd-Frank, the FDIC was dealing with state-chartered banks, correct? And prior to Dodd-Frank, with regard to national chartered banks, it was the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency.
Well, you also have the Federal Reserve as well as a
And
prudential
Federal Reserve.
regulator.
So we had 3 federal bank regulatory agencies already providing regulatory oversight and ensuring compliance with all these banks, national chartered banks and state chartered banks.
Correct.
I wasn't here when this law was passed. What is it that this new agency is supposed to do that's different than what was already being done with those federal bank regulatory agencies?
Well, unfortunately, what has happened is a complete outsourcing of Article I legislative authority to an agency that is essentially unaccountable to anyone. This is arguably the single most unaccountable, powerful agency in the history of the Republic that, on balance, I believe has hurt consumers. And I recited the facts earlier. Free checking cut in half, bank fees gone up, mortgages more difficult to come by, costing hundreds of dollars more to close, fewer credit card offerings, costing more. So, number one, the best way to protect consumers is through competitive, innovative, transparent markets, which the CFPB has hurt. Second of all, was essentially set up here is, for lack of a better term, a benevolent dictatorship. Well, was
eight-
there some suggestion before that the federal regulatory agencies weren't doing their job?
Well, it has to do with the narrative of those who passed Dodd-Frank. I recall the cynical comments of the now mayor of Chicago, Rahm Emanuel, said, "Never let a serious crisis go to waste."
Well, I
It
guess
allows
that's-
you to do things that you were never able to do before. And so you can make a case. I don't object to centralizing the consumer protection function in a particular agency. What I object to is one that on balance hurts consumers and one that is unaccountable. It's unaccountable to the president since the director can only be removed from cause. It's unaccountable to Congress because it's not part of the appropriations process. It's unaccountable to the courts because it's subject to the Chevron doctrine, which gives deference to CFPB's pronouncements in interpretation of federal law. And then it's even unaccountable to itself because there's not a them or an it, there's only a him. One unaccountable, unelected individual can decide what credit cards go in our wallet, whether or not we can have a mortgage, whether or not we can have a bank account. His total discretion in deciding if a product is abusive, for which there is no legal definition whatsoever, he alone, Richard Cordray, can abuse tens of millions of consumers around this nation and take away their economic liberty to choose the credit card, mortgage, and bank account that's best for them.
Well, I don't represent Wall Street. I mean, I represent Lower Alabama. We don't have Wall Street banks. And I haven't heard from any Wall Street bank about this bill.
They oppose
What
the
I've
bill.
heard from is these community banks in my district, and community banks in my district, probably like everybody else. You go into town, everybody knows who owns the bank. Everybody knows all the officers of the bank. All the people that own the bank and the officers of the bank know everybody in town. They know how to make loans because they know everybody in the community. They know who's creditworthy and who's not. And they had this relationship for years with the federal regulators that made sure they were compliant with federal laws. And now we wipe all that away. We come in with this new agency, which, as you said, is basically a new star chamber because there's no accountability for
An
them.
apt description.
And they go into these little rural towns and say, no, you can't do that anymore. And oh, by the way, if you're going to do it, here's a ton of paperwork you got to make sure you and your folks got to fill out. And I've sat there and watched some of the closings, by the way, and people just signing pieces of paper and not reading anything because nobody's got the time nor the expertise to read most of the things that they're having to sign. I'm just trying to figure out, who are we benefiting here? I can tell you, in my district, no one's been benefited. And by the way, those little community banks in my district, they did not cause the financial meltdown of the 2008, 2009 period. My little community banks, they're just doing their thing, making loans to good people in their community that they know, and the people were paying their loans. So I don't understand why a law that's supposed to stop what happened because of these big banks up in New York or somewhere, because of what they did, why they got to go mess up all the things in community banks in Lower Alabama? Why they got to do that? Who's being benefited here? It's certainly not the consumers. The consumers are being penalized here because it's all this new paperwork and all this new cost that falls on the consumer. So the sham that this is somehow, this Dodd-Frank law protects consumers, Dodd-Frank hurt consumers. It continues to hurt consumers, and it's hurting the American economy. And I wasn't here when it was passed. I don't know why we needed all that stuff. Frankly, if this was a law if this bill that you've got was something that the big banks wanted, they sure hadn't come and seen me about it. But all those community banks in my district, they've been parading to my door saying, please do something about this.
Well, if you would yield on that point, according to the Wall Street Journal, according to the Washington Post, according to the New York Times, the big banks oppose the Financial Choice Act. Several of the CEOs have publicly stated that Dodd-Frank gives them a competitive advantage. And it's one of the reasons, again, we're losing a community bank a day or credit union a day is because of the Dodd-Frank Act. So you ask who it benefits. It has actually benefited in some respects the Wall Street banks. They may have not liked it at the time. They probably didn't like paying hundreds of millions in compliance costs, but they recognize it as a competitive advantage now, and they want their bailout. Dodd-Frank gives them a bailout. The Financial Choice Act takes it away and says, no, if you fail, you have to face bankruptcy.
which is one of the reasons why the Independent Community Bankers of America and 50 out of 50 state banking associations have endorsed the Financial Choice Act, as has hundreds of groups, including the Concerned Veterans of America, who said the changes to CFPB, quote, will protect consumers by preserving their right to make informed financial choices instead of Washington's typical one-size-fits-all approach. Mr. Chairman, I would ask that that letter be included as part of the record.
Without objection.
Mr. Chairman? I wonder if I might just
Mr.
briefly,
Kilby, I'd be happy for you to say something.
briefly respond. And I appreciate the question about whether or not the regulators somehow missed the point during the lead up to the crisis, or whether they somehow failed. I think that is a legitimate question, and I would just offer a couple of observations on that. And it goes to the core of my earlier testimony. We have pretty good empirical evidence of what happens when we return to this sort of a regulatory environment. It happened already. And in fact, we're still dealing with it. We haven't recovered from the 2007, 2008 crisis. It's impossible for me to accept that the regulatory environment and the lack of intervention somehow didn't contribute to that, but don't take my word for it. The final report of the National Commission on the Causes of the Financial Economic Crisis in the U.S., a report that was issued in 2011, lays it right at the doorstep of the regulatory environment at that time, the failures of the financial services regulators to deal with these predatory practices triggered the crisis. It says, and I quote, as irresponsible lending, including predatory and fraudulent practices, became more prevalent, the Federal Reserve and other regulators and authorities heard warnings from many quarters, yet the Federal Reserve neglected its mission, quote, to ensure the safety and soundness of the nation's banking and financial system and to protect the credit rights of consumers, unquote. It failed to build the retaining wall before it was too late. The Office of the Comptroller of the Currency and the Office of Thrift Supervision, caught up in turf wars, preempted state regulators from reining in abuses, unquote. So I think there is some evidence that the regulatory structure was inadequate to deal with the conditions that led to the crisis and contributed to them.
Well, taking my time back, I don't think that's true with regard to what they were doing with regard to consumer protection with little banks in places far away from New York, because that's not where the problem was. The problem was in other places. So we took that authority away from them and gave it to this other agency that's got no accountability, which strikes me as being passing on in the American governmental system, that we have some unelected person that's got nobody they've got to be responsible to. And I just got to tell you, from having watched things happen in community banks, I don't think we help the consumers any. I think we hurt them. I'm sorry, Chairman, I think there was something you wanted to say.
Well, I just wanted to say that, frankly, deregulation narrative is a myth. For the 10 years leading up to the financial crisis, there was a 17% increase in financial regulation, probably next to health care and nuclear power. I'm not sure there's any more regulated industry in America before, during, or after the financial crisis than the financial services industry. It wasn't deregulation, it was dumb regulation. Dumb regulation incenting, cajoling, mandating financial institutions to loan money to people to buy homes they couldn't afford to keep. Think Fannie and Freddie. That was the cause of the crisis. And Dodd-Frank has absolutely nothing to do with that. Instead, it has harmed our economy, it has harmed consumers, and it's time to replace it.
Well, thank you both. I appreciate your helping to clarify this for me. And, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you very much, gentleman. Yields back to time. The gentleman from Colorado, Mr. Polis. Gentleman does not seek time. The gentleman from Colorado does not seek time. The gentlewoman does not seek time from Wyoming. Gentlemen, thank you very much. I appreciate your indulgence with the committee to allow us the opportunity to ask you the questions on this very important bill. And, Mr. Chairman, I wish you luck. If you please remember that anything you brought in writing that would be available to our awesome stenographer would certainly enable her to complete the record appropriately, and thank you very much. The committee will now welcome the second panel, the gentleman from North Carolina, the honorable gentleman, my dear friend Walter Jones, the gentlewoman Marcy Captor, the gentleman Matt Gans, the gentlewoman Jackie Rosen, and last I'm going to acknowledge the gentleman from Windsor, Colorado, the gentleman, a member of the committee who would be available to either speak from the dais or to come to the table as he would choose, but we'll go to Mr. Buck at the last instance. Well, I thought we had a couple other members here. I noticed, I know the gentleman, Matt Gans, was here, so we will hold a place for him. Mr. Jones, we're delighted that you're here. The gentleman from North Carolina is a distinguished member of this body, and we're delighted that you are here. Without objection, anything you and any other member of this panel have will be entered in the record. The gentleman's recognized.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much.
Yes, sir.
I'm here with the lady from Ohio, Ms. Capta, who's been a friend of mine for many, many years. And I'm going to go first. My comments are going to be shorter. She has more to say on this issue of her amendment, which I 100% support. Of all the bills that I have voted for in 22 years, the two that I regret the most were, first, the unnecessary war in Iraq, and second, the repeal of Glass-Steagall, which took place in 1999, the repeal of Glass-Steagall. I had constituents back in my district, some in the securities business, some in the insurance business, asking me not to repeal Glass-Steagall, to keep those industries separate. Because, and now after I made this mistake in 1999, I can see how that change in the existing law by repealing Glass-Steagall had created the chaos that we have seen on Wall Street. I call it greed, quite frankly. I was here when we bailed out Wall Street. I was here when we had to stay up all weekend. Many of you were here as well. What do? We bailed out dishonesty and greed. And I believe sincerely that what we are doing today, this has nothing to do with the Choice Act or the Unchoice Act. I think both of them ought to be set aside, and let's put the repeal of Glass-Steagall on the floor, the reinstatement of Glass-Steagall on the floor. Let's see how that debate goes, and see how the consumers, not the special interests, but how the consumers will get behind a reinstatement of Glass-Steagall. In fact, President Trump has stated many times that he believes there should be some type of a new Glass-Steagall. No details on it, but that he believes that we do need to come back to a discussion and debate of Glass-Steagall. A couple other points very quickly. I don't know if any of you remember, I happened to vote against it, but a year ago in 2016, the Buffett mobile home business has most to gain from deregulation plan. And the reason, I'm going to read this very quickly. Clayton Home is pushing Congress to roll back consumer protections on mobile home loans. Warren Buffett's mobile home business wants Congress to curtail recent consumer safeguards put in place after the financial crisis, saying a rollback is necessary to ensure that competing lenders continue to provide loans. But in reality, the deregulation plan that recently passed the United States House would be a boon almost exclusively for the Buffett's Clayton Homes. According to an analysis of 2013 federal loan data by the Seattle Times, based on interest rates levels from that year, Clayton controlled 91% of the market segment set to be deregulated. I don't know why we do not see the value of having some type of a debate on a reinstatement of Glass-Steagall. The last point I want to make, I have Camp Lejeune Marine Base in my district, and I have seen the Marines, particularly at a young age, taken advantage of. And I want to say this, that I agree with the veterans of foreign wars, that too much in this Choice Act will be, in my humble opinion, a disadvantage to those who wear the uniform. So again, I stand here with a lady from Ohio, a very dear friend of mine, Marcy Capta, and I support her amendment and her position on this issue. Thank you for giving me this chance to share my concerns and my belief about what needs to be done for the consumer. Thank you.
Mr. Jones, we're delighted that you're here, and thank you very much, not only for your intellectual contribution to this, but your ideas, and they're always welcome at the Rules Committee. Ms. Capter, we're delighted that you're here, and the gentlewoman's recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ranking Member Slaughter, and honorable committee members, thank you for granting us the opportunity to speak before you with this bipartisan amendment to H.R. 10, and I'm very honored to be here with my esteemed colleague, gentleman of great integrity from North Carolina, Mr. Jones. Our amendment proposes to table the current legislation that you have been considering and instead substitute our legislation to fix the fundamental danger in today's banking system, and that is the severe tilt away from prudent banking toward risky speculation. Frankly, if you in your deliberations choose to allow us to go to the floor with a freestanding bill, we'll accept that too. Our bill would essentially move our financial system toward a healthier, more competitive, less concentrated financial system because it would guarantee more robust economic growth. So it's pro-competition. Our bill, the Return to Prudent Banking Act, says the answer to economic growth rests on separating risky speculation from prudent banking. It reinstates the Glass-Steagall Act separation between the type of banking that places bets and the type of banking that takes consumer deposits and hopefully then pays fair interest for retaining people's money and makes fair-priced loans. For nearly 7 decades following the Great Depression, financial institutions were barred from acting in any combination as both commercial and speculative banks. This worked out very well for most of the 20th century, and our financial system and the nation's GDP grew exponentially over 65 years. That era has been described as golden, as wolves were not allowed to prey on the people's hard-earned depository savings. And during that era, consumers were paid a fair rent for their money. But in 1999, Congress repealed the Glass-Steagall Act. Both Walter and I were here during that consideration. That action clearly accelerated a system that now a handful of Wall Street institutions have taken majority control of America's financial future. Banks grew riskier. Speculation was embedded in prudent banking to a level that allowed pure greed to win. And the American taxpayer was given the mammoth bill when the deregulated financial sector fell apart. Since 2008, adding insult to injury, the perpetrators responsible for the economic crisis got even bigger. All the numbers prove that. Post-2008 financial crisis, America continues on a path to mega banking. Enormous accumulation of banking assets now rests largely with the Big Six. And I'll say their names: J.P. Morgan Chase, Bank of America, Citigroup, Wells Fargo, Goldman Sachs, and Morgan Stanley largely control the movement of nearly 2/3 of the money in our economy. The Big Six combined own 62% of $16.2 trillion worth of banking assets. And for each of us, we must ask the question, do you believe that 62% by only 6 is far too much power in too few hands? Banking profits were at record highs last year of $170 billion. Unfair competition has reduced the number of commercial banks to approximately 5,000 across this nation of 50 states. When I was first elected to Congress, there were 15,000 such institutions. Since 1989, accelerating more after 2008, the number of commercial banks in the United States has been cut by almost 60%. Think about that. With increased regulatory burdens, non-Wall Street banks and credit unions have been diminished even more. And we see mergers, we see extinction. The number of credit unions has been reduced by half. This consolidation to mega mergers means less competition and less service to consumers, and where service is granted, more expensive service. Before the 2008 collapse, the Big Six banks earned an average profit of $25 billion Since the economic collapse, and despite Dodd-Frank, from 2009 to 2014, they have now doubled that profit to $41.7 billion. That's a 66.4% increase in just 5 years to the Big Six. So where has modern mega banking taken us? Let's look at the depositors that we all represent. Main Street Americans' certificates of deposit and checking accounts are being paid at the lowest rate in modern history, having fallen under 1% over the past decade. Grandma Moses earns almost nothing on her CD, carefully saved over decades. In fact, her nest egg actually is losing money, factoring in inflation, because the banks pay so little for her, actually pay so little to her to rent her money. Yet Goldman Sachs is trading at record levels since the start of this administration, and meanwhile, 5.4 million homeowners still remain underwater on their mortgage due to the collapse of 2008. J.P. Morgan Chase, the largest of the Big Six, said it expects to get even bigger and more profitable in the next few years, having reached $2.49 trillion in assets at the end of 2016 alone. That's too much power in too few hands. Clearly, a giant transfer of wealth is accelerating from Main Street to Wall Street. Competitors are being eaten up, and the banks are not paying depositors fair rent for their money. Now, Democratic presidential candidate Bernie Sanders ran on a campaign to break up the banks. So did Republican Donald Trump. At a campaign rally, the president even stated, and I quote, "It's time for a 21st century Glass-Steagall." Democrats and Republicans have both memorialized support for reinstating Glass-Steagall in their platforms, and the RNC wasted fewer words than the Democratic platform, saying plainly, quote, "We support reinstating the Glass-Steagall Act of 1933, unquote, which prohibits commercial banks from engaging in high-risk investment." In closing, with our bipartisan amendment to H.R. 10, now is the time to go full throttle. Our nation has a real shot to get this right before another looming financial crisis, perhaps anchored in corporate borrowing, hits. Congress has the ability to deliver both party platforms and restore Glass-Steagall to secure the financial system's well-being so our nation can be fair to the generations to come. With bipartisan support, the time for Glass-Steagall is now. We must not wait, and frankly, America should not wait. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you, Ranking Member Slaughter, and all the honorable members of this committee. Please give us a chance at least to have a fair debate on reinstating the Glass-Steagall Act. I think the American people would welcome it.
Thank you very much. The chair would ask the clerk of the remaining time and what the floor looks like, please, for the members that are in attendance.
The vote will expire shortly, but 120 members are still out.
Some 120 members are not out. Mr. Buck, how much time did you perceive you would wish to? I'm sorry? Okay, well, would the gentleman like to be recognized at all for his amendment or to speak on that for any period of time? The gentleman would not seek time. Thank you very much. Okay. Ms. Slaughter, does your side have any questions for the panel that is here?
All right, no? We support the amendment. All three of us.
Gentlewoman, I had been advised that you did not, we're not seeking time. Is there any other member that would seek time with the panel? Seeing none, I want to thank both of you for taking time to be with us. Please be advised that we're now on a vote. So I'd like to acknowledge that the gentleman, Mr. Steve Amerson, America's tenor, a hero of Veterans of America, a gentleman who sings at almost every single event that honors men and women who have been recognized by our United States military across the country. And I want to thank Mr. Emerson for taking time to be here. Also, I noticed Mr. Harris Jones of Ole Miss is here with him, a young student. So this will now, is there any other member that would seek time before the committee? Seeing none, This will now close the hearing portion of H.R. 10 Choice Act. Chair will now be instructed a motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 2213, the Anti-Border Corruption Reauthorization Act of 2017, a structured rule. The rule provides 1 hour of debate equally divided and controlled by the chair and ranking minority member of the Committee on Homeland Security. Rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule provides that the amendment in the nature of substitute recommended by the Committee on Homeland Security, now printed in the bill, shall be considered as adopted. The bill, as amended, shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against provisions in the bill as amended. The rule makes an order only the further amendment printed in the Rules Committee report, if offered by the member designated in the report, which shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and unopponent, shall not be subject to amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. Rule waives all points of order against the amendment printed in the report. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
You now heard the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma, H.R. 2213. Is there discussion or amendment to that? Seeing none, the vote will now be on the bill H.R. 2213, the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
The ayes have it, the ayes have it. Accordingly, the gentlewoman from, the vote is approved, the motion is approved. The gentlewoman from Wyoming, Mrs. Cheney, will be handling this for Republicans. And Mrs. Slaughter will be handling this for Democrats. Chair will now be in receipt of a motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma, H.R. 10, the Choice Act.
Mr. Chairman, I move the committee grant H.R. 10, the Financial Choice Act of 2017, a structured rule. The rule provides 90 minutes of general debate, equally divided and controlled by the chair and the ranking member of the Committee on Financial Services. Rule waives all points of order against consideration of the bill. The rule makes an order as original text for the purposes of amendment, an amendment in the nature of a substitute printed in Part A of the Rules Committee report, and provides that it shall be considered as read. The rule waives all points of order against that amendment in the nature of a substitute. The rule makes an order only those further amendments printed in Part B of the Rules Committee report. Each such amendment may be offered only in the order printed in the report, may be offered only by the member designated in the report, shall be considered as read, shall be debatable for the time specified in the report, equally divided and controlled by the proponent and unopponent, shall not be subject to an amendment, and shall not be subject to a demand for division of the question. The rule waives all points of order against the amendments printed in Part B of the report. Finally, the rule provides one motion to recommit with or without instructions.
Now heard the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Is there amendment or discussion?
Mr. Chairman?
Gentleman's record.
I have an amendment to the rule. I move the committee make an order and give the necessary waivers for the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 10 by Representative Capter, number 14, which would strike the text of the bill and insert H.R. 790, the Return to Prudent Banking Act of 2017.
Thank you very much. Discussion? Seeing none, the vote will now be on the McGovern amendment. Those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. No. Noes have it, noes have it. Is there any other amendment or discussion? Seeing none, the vote will now be on the H.R. 10, the motion from the gentleman from Oklahoma. Those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed, no.
No.
Ayes have it, ayes have it.
Roll call.
Gentleman asks for a roll call. Gentlewoman asks for a roll call vote. Clerk will poll the committee.
Mr. Cole. Aye. Mr. Cole, aye. Mr. Woodall. Mr. Woodall, aye. Mr. Burgess. Mr. Burgess, aye. Mr. Collins. Mr. Collins, aye. Mr. Byrne. Mr. Byrne, aye. Mr. Newhouse. Mr. Newhouse, aye. Mr. Buck. Mr. Buck, aye. Ms. Cheney. Ms. Cheney, aye. Ms. Slaughter.
No.
Ms. Slaughter, no. Mr. McGovern.
No.
Mr. McGovern, no. Mr. Hastings. Mr. Hastings, no. Mr. Polis. Mr. Chairman.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, aye.
Clerk report total.
9 yeas, 3 nays.
The motion is agreed to, and accordingly, the gentleman from Windsor, Colorado, Mr. Buck, will be handling this for Republicans. The gentleman, Mr. Hastings, will be handling this for Democrats. Please be advised that we have no...
It's okay. Hastings and I swapped. We just forgot to tell you.
Excuse me. I made a mistake. Could I please get a clarification?
I'm going to do the choice bill. Mr. Hastings is going to do the border bill.
Okay, so H.R. 2213, Mrs. Cheney will be handling this for Republicans, and Mr. Hastings will be handling this for Democrats. H.R. 10, floor manager will be Mr. Buck and Mrs. Slaughter.
How am I recorded,
Thank you
Mr.
very much.
Chairman?
Sir, thank you very much. The clerk would please report H.R. 10, how the gentleman from Colorado is,
Mr. Polis is not recorded.
he is not recorded. Does the gentleman wish to record his vote?
Yes, can I ask unanimous consent to record a no vote?
Without objection, that will be entered in the record. The gentleman from Colorado offers a no vote to H.R. 10. The clerk will please provide the tally to the chairman.
9 yeas, 4 nays.
The motion is agreed to, and it's passed from the gentleman from Oklahoma. The motion is adopted. The gentleman is recorded appropriately. He was recorded on a recorded vote, and I thank the gentleman very much. Upon instructions of the chairman, I'm going to enter into the record a list of visitors who was provided to me who were part of today's hearing, and I appreciate those young students who attended, in addition to the gentleman from University of Ole Miss, Thomas Jones. Without objection, this now finishes our hearing for the day. We have no more hearings this week. Thank you very much. Let's close our hearing today.